Okay, let's get started, everybody. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining today's webinar on the hidden history of monopolies, how big business destroyed the American dream. I'm Ali Reza Vahabzadeh, the Vice President and Head of Memberships at the American Sustainable Business Council. For those of you who don't know, the American Sustainable Business Council is the leading business organization serving the public policy interests of responsible companies, their customers, and other stakeholders. We were founded in 2009, and today our membership represents over 250,000 businesses in a wide range of industries. ASBC advocates for policy change and informs business owners, policymakers, and the public about the need and opportunities for building a vibrant, broadly prosperous, and sustainable economy. As some of you may know, we recently entered into a strategic alliance with Social Venture Circle. This is a very exciting time for both organizations, as we believe this new partnership will create the country's leading socially responsible business group and unite top US entrepreneurs and the leaders of mission-driven companies in common cause, while amplifying and extending the collective voice of the sustainable business community. Today's webinar features Thom Hartmann and David Korten, who will share how monopolies threaten our systems and economy and the damage that they have done to so many industries and individuals. I will hand it over to David now to start the webinar, and 20 minutes to the next half hour, wherever you are. I'm on Eastern time at 4:10. We will conclude the prepared remarks and open it up to Q&A. So for everybody on the Zoom, please put your questions in the Q&A or the chat, or raise your hand, and we can take your questions that way during the Q&A. So without further ado, Dave, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Ali Reza. I'm really looking forward to this discussion because being familiar with the American Sustainable Business Council, I know that you are serious. You're an association of business leaders committed to advancing public policies that are truly supportive of businesses that exist to serve the communities in which they function. Real commitment, no greenwash, no bullshit. And of course, Thom is America's leading political talk show host. He's also my very longtime friend and colleague with the deepest grasp of American history of anyone I know. At the same time, having an extraordinarily up-to-date, up-to-minute knowledge of virtually every aspect of contemporary politics. So such an opportunity to put these two pieces together. And Thom, of course, will be focused on sharing insights from his latest book, The History of Monopoly. Now, in preparing for this webinar, I've been rereading that book, and it truly raises my consciousness of the extent to which history is an essential tool in dealing with today's defining issues. For example, if you read history carefully, you realize that real democracy has never yet been achieved on a consequential scale. It remains an aspiration. And we say much the same for an economy that truly secures the well-being of people and community. So a return to some idealized, non-existent past is not our goal. To create the world we want, we must draw on the lessons of the past to create a new future that is quite different from anything that humans have previously experienced. So Thom, your book is a powerful look at why the concentration of corporate power is a key driver of the inequality and environmental damage that are pushing ever more people into lives of desperation. And I note that monopoly is also a defining issue for the ASBC. So that means that this discussion has real potential consequences. So let's get on with some context here. You open this book with an intention getter. Quote, "We pay a monopoly tax in the United States of around $5,000 per person," unquote. Most people could make rather good use of an extra $5,000 a year, and clearly what you call a tax is not going to the government. So lead us into this. Explain a bit, what is the tax you're referring to and who gets it?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Ali Reza. It's an honor to be here, and with both of you. The additional $5,000 a year that each one of us is paying, compared to what citizens of the European Union, for example, pay, or citizens of Canada pay, I call it a monopoly tax. It's not a tax collected by the government. It's money that's going to giant corporation. And it's really a function of a lack of competition. We pay between 2 and 10 times more for pharmaceuticals than anybody else in the world. We pay more than twice as much for internet service as any other developed country in the world. And by and large, the quality of that service is between 10 and 30% as good as most other countries. We pay about twice as much for cell phone service as anybody in the world. We pay more for, basically we pay more for airfare. Pick an industrial sector, and you will find that Americans are paying absurdly high prices. We don't realize it, it seems, because it's been incrementally creeping in for years and years and years. But that's what I'm talking about, David. And I think the larger picture in that context is the question, why do you even have an economy? Because that $5,000 a year that the average American is paying to these giant corporations that isn't paid by other people is a function of the fact that the rules of business in the United States are different from the rules of business in the rest of the developed world. And so, in theory, you establish the rules of the game. Economics or business is nothing, more than a game, much like football, right? It's you have specific rules, you have people who enforce the rules, you have penalties for breaking the rules, and historically, and this is what Adam Smith laid out in Theory of Moral Sentiments and touched on in Wealth of Nations back in the day. David Ricardo wrote about it at length on labor in 1819. Historically, governments establish the rules of the game for economies in order to benefit the nation generally and its individual citizens personally. And, that's the way it should be. The problem is that these very, very large economic interests seized control of the US government in the late 70s and early 80s. The Reagan Revolution was kind of the peak of that. And between the Supreme Court and actual legislative decisions that have been made and regulatory decisions that have been made, have been steadily for 40 years now, year after year after year, recalibrating the rule system in America to make it easier for giant corporations to rip us off and dominate the marketplace and keep out small and medium-sized competitors. And that's why we have that essentially $5,000 monopoly tax.
Wow. Now, a little later in the book, you talk about corporate CEOs stealing wages from labor. And I'm fascinated as you look at this, putting this together, that you really frame it as a competition between capital, which in most meaning really just refers to money, which banks create out of nothing with a computer keystroke, versus labor. And labor, of course, is the work by which we produce all the things of real value. So when you talk about CEOs stealing wages from labor, essentially for capital, how exactly does that work?
Well, Abraham Lincoln made the point that nothing happens until somebody does something. That labor, without labor, you don't have an economy, and that historically there was. Well, I was going to say historically there was some balance between labor and capital, or labor and management. But actually the history of America is the seesaw history of capital or management. We could use the words interchangeably, I suppose. On the one hand, trying to assert power over labor, and on the other hand, labor trying to assert their rights within that context. The most extreme example of that, the most egregious example of that, of course, was slavery, where labor has absolutely no rights. And the pinnacle in American history of labor having rights was the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when the United States was quite heavily unionized. Almost a third of the American workforce was unionized. That's nowhere close to, Northern European countries that are 70, 80, 90% unionized. But it was a peak for the United States. And it coincided with a time when America was growing very rapidly, the most rapid economic growth that we've had in the country, in the history of the country. But more importantly, that the American middle class was growing wealthy, the wealth and income being, what you get every week or every month or every year, and wealth being what you can hang on to. Both income and wealth for working class people in the United States were actually growing faster, or at a faster rate anyway, than were the income and wealth of the multimillionaire class, the CEO class, right up until the 1980s. And in large part, that was a function of our tax policy, which Reagan blew up, and the Reagan Revolution blew up. But the bottom line is there's always been this dynamic tension between the two. And to the extent that monopoly asserts itself in order to push out competition, the other benefit from the point of view of capital or of management is that monopoly also not only gives companies monopolies or oligopolies, not only gives them extraordinary power in the marketplace, in the product and service marketplace, but it also gives them extraordinary power in the labor marketplace, which is a very real thing too. Reference to my earlier reference to David Ricardo, and so as a consequence of that, the more as capital has become more and more monopoly-like in the United States, the power of labor has been radically diminished. In part because of rule changes from the Supreme Court, in part because of, as I mentioned, legal and regulatory changes, but also in part because corporations have adapted to those changes in ways that give them vastly more power. So now we're down to the point where only about 6% of the American workforce, the non-governmental workforce, is unionized. And the result of that is that 10 years ago in 2010, for the first time since the 1960s, fewer than 50% of Americans are in the American middle class. Today, fewer than half of Americans are making more than $30,000 a year, which is, just the ragged edge of being able to survive in America economically.
Yeah, it's interesting when we get into this. It takes me back to this phenomenon we both noted, that there was a time in the United States, of course, a time around the world, when perhaps the majority of the population lived on farms. So they had their own farms and gardens and actually produced much of their own food, much of the things they needed to survive. And part of the nature of our current economy is that the way we've restructured things, our access to most of the things we depend on to survive depend on money. And of course, what we refer to as the capitalists have taken total control of the creation and allocation of money, and we depend on them for access to the things we actually need, as well as our labor. Now, just taking this a little further, during the days when we were a middle-class nation following World War II, the top individual tax rate reached 94%. And I noted in your book that you mentioned that the tax rate was also 91% back in 1921 when Warren Harding became president and knocked it out. Explain to us, how did these top tax rates actually impact the concentration of corporate power, and how CEOs managed that power? And then, how significant is that for the issues that we're dealing with today?
Right. The income tax was authorized in 1913, as I recall, and Woodrow Wilson raised the income tax rate up to 91% in order to pay for World War I. Warren Harding in 1920 ran for office he had two slogans. One was more business in government, less government in business, which means privatize and deregulate, and a return to normalcy, which meant drop the top tax rate back down. He took it back down to 25%. And that was for the extreme top. Most Americans didn't even pay income tax back in the 1920s. So that, it went down during that period of time. And when it was higher, we didn't so much see it during the World War I era and, leading up to the Roaring '20s, because it wasn't a long enough period of time of high taxation. But we saw it real clearly from the late 30s, early 40s, all the way through the early 1980s, when the top tax rate was 91%, 94%. Lyndon Johnson dropped it down to 74% in 1967, which is where it stood until Reagan knocked it down to 25%. And what we saw as a consequence of that top tax rate being so high was that people who had the potential to earn really high incomes, people who basically could control their own income, the CEOs of companies, and people who were handling money in a way that gave them a lot of control over it. Took that kind of income tax kicked in after around $3 million a year back in the 70s. And so basically CEOs just didn't take a salary beyond $3 million a year, because why pay 74% income tax or 94% income tax for that matter? And the result of that was that they reinvested the money in their businesses. They paid their workers better. They expanded their companies. They strengthened their companies and things like this. There were a bunch of rules changes that were made in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. One was to allow CEOs and corporate officers to compensate themselves with stock, and which led to this wild financialization that we're seeing, where corporations are taking COVID money and using it to buy back their own stock, which just jacks up their stock price, which simply increases compensation for the senior CEO, the senior management. So that's where we're at, and the net effect though of these high tax rates, and you see this all around the world. Most countries have a combined tax rate that is in the neighborhood of 50%. Canada, most of the European Union, when you combine all the various taxes that people pay, and what it tends to do is act as a stabilizer, an economic stabilizer. It strengthens the bottom half of the economy economically, the working end of the economy, or the bottom 70 or 80% of the economy, really, on the one hand. And it also tends to insulate countries against the periodic boom and bust nature of capitalism. And it is built into capitalism that every 7, 8, 9 years you have a recession. And by having that higher tax rate, it provides for a stronger social safety net, so that when capitalism fails, more or less every decade, it allows people to survive that failure without losing their homes and losing their lives. We have, some 10 million people who are on the verge of homelessness right now, facing eviction. 8 million families right now that don't have enough to eat as a consequence of a failure to do that, I would say in large part because of the Reagan Revolution.
Interesting. I was struck by your observation that those high tax rates were put in place to finance our wars. And now we find ourselves, essentially, we're in a war with capitalism. And our survival depends on healing the environment that capitalism has been destroying, and meeting the essential needs of all people at the same time, which is another, another need created by capitalism. So here we have a reason to raise those taxes to finance another war. In a way, it depends on how you define capitalism. In a way, the goal needs to be to humanize capitalism, because we're not really totally against some degree of private ownership and markets. It's just we need to do it in a very different way. But let's now turn to the corporate charter.
Well, if I could just reference
that
quickly, David, I would reframe that slightly and say capitalism is at war with humanity and life on Earth. Rather than we're at war with capitalism. And this is a war that
we're on the other, that is the war, we're on the other side of it.
Right, and this is a war that they have been fighting against us since the 1970s. Lewis Powell kicked this off in '71 with his infamous memo, and then the FEE, the FEE. This was a real estate lobbying group created around the same time. This group called the Libertarian Party, which was really just a PR stunt to put a political or legitimate patina on the idea of completely deregulating the economy and turning basically all the power of governance outside of the military and the police over to billionaires and giant corporations. And we now have, a number of billionaires who have been openly promoting this for years and years. David Koch, who has passed away, but his brother Charles continues the work. David Koch ran on the libertarian ticket in 1980 on a platform of, ending all public school in the United States, privatizing Medicare and Medicaid, shutting down the EPA and all regulatory agencies, privatizing the post office, privatizing all the public roads in America, basically, turn everything in the country except for police and the military over to giant corporations. And right now, half our military budget is going to corporations rather than to the military. A very, very different situation than we had during World War II. So, and this worldview that these guys are promoting is essentially sociopathic. It's me. It's all the rights of capital and billionaires and giant corporations. They get to do whatever they damn well please, and they control everything, and they have all the power, the political power, the economic power, and ultimately the power of the state. The power to imprison people under their own terms. And we, the people, have watched, particularly, it was particularly obvious with stripping union rights. We have watched our power be ripped away from us step by step by step over these last 40 years that we've been in this, Reaganomics era. And that's an extraordinarily destructive thing, not just economically, not just for the working people of this country, but for democracy itself. And we've got a serious problem in this country with these corporations that are acting as if they are sociopathic, and many of the billionaires who are promoting these ideas who apparently have no consideration for their impact on average people.
Yeah, I want to take your sociopathic just a little bit further. Whenever we're dealing with these particular situations, we run into, again, when we use the term capital, which sounds like something real and solid, and of course, natural capital is real, labor is actually a form of capital, human capital. But usually in the conversation, when we refer to capital or when we refer to wealth, we're talking about money. And of course, this whole context test of the billionaire financiers is to get control of money. Now, money is a ticket to power, but it's also obvious if you think about it that money itself is simply a number. It has no intrinsic wealth or intrinsic value. So if we ended up on an island, it was a desert island with no water, but a big bag of money, that money would be totally useless. And we're in an economy that's all built around creating money and competing for money, and in the process, destroying Earth's capacity to support life, all the things that our well-being actually depends on, and also stripping workers of the wages that they need in that kind of an economy where we all depend on money in order to buy the things we actually need. So, this sociopathy is truly extraordinary because in the large sense, we are destroying Earth's capacity to sustain life in order to grow these numbers on computer hard drives that have absolutely no value in themselves. But I want to turn to the question of the corporate charter.
Could I address what you just said?
Okay, sure.
My sense of money is a little less abstract than yours, David. I view, and we refer to it as money or as dollars, but every society since the advent of agriculture has had some form of a medium of exchange, basically a proxy for wealth. And I think of money as a representation of energy. and in fact, my favorite science fiction author, Jack Vance, created this whole universe, and throughout the Gaian reach throughout the universe, the single currency is called the SVU, the single value unit, which represents 1 hour of any person's labor. And so the currency is literally tied to labor. But if you think of money as energy, as basically representing human labor, as representing the work that because no economy exists without human labor. Whether it's a service economy, you've got the people at McDonald's saying, "Do you want fries with that?" Or this manufacturing economy, you got somebody making things, whatever it may be. All of that human labor is what is creating the wealth that we're quantifying with money. And so what I would argue is that when billionaires are accumulating massive amounts of money, what they're doing is they're basically taking our energy, they're taking our labor, they are taking our work, and they are putting it in places where it's not accessible to the rest of us, and it's not accessible to the economy as a whole, generally speaking, but only to them. And is being used to make more money, making money with money, which is the essence of what capitalism or being a capitalist is. So I think if we reframe money to think of it in those terms, then we have a new foundation for a conversation about how money should be used and how destructive the financialization of our economy is, which is a whole nother conversation, but I think an important one.
But in that process, if we forget that the real value is in the labor, not in the money, we tend to attribute the value to the money, and that leads us into all the intellectual traps that we slip into in our current very deeply.
Yeah, and this was the point that Adam Smith made. I think probably the most important point that Adam Smith made was in Wealth of Nations was that the wealth of nations is the result of labor being applied to things. If you have a tree,
labor.
Yeah, if you have a tree branch laying on the ground, it has no intrinsic value. The country, the wealth of the country is unaffected by it. But if a person picks up that tree branch and uses a knife to whittle it into an axe handle that can be sold, and that axe handle can be used, right, to chop wood and things, now you have actually created wealth by applying labor to raw materials, and that wealth can be passed down through generations as long as that axe handle survives. Yeah. And which is, again, another conversation about the importance of manufacturing, but I'll stop.
I do want to get to the issue of the corporate charter, because I think that's truly foundational to this whole thing. What strikes me as the for-profit corporate charter as we know it is basically a license to concentrate on limited private power to grow the financial assets of shareholders, who are inevitably society's richer members, with limited liability for the harms that they may cause in using that power, harms to nature and to other people. So tell us about the days when a corporation, to get a charter, it had to be to fulfill a public purpose, and the corporation faced a death penalty, a literal death penalty, if it failed to fulfill that purpose. Should that clause or that idea be reinstated? And how might you implement it in the case of a very large corporation like Amazon, recognizing you can't just lock the door and send everyone home? It's become such a fixture in our economy. We've got to somehow transfer the functions it's performing to some other kinds of structures. How do you think about that?
Well, I think the response to Amazon should be more like Richard Nixon's response to AT&T. They should be broken up rather than killed off. But with regard to the corporate death penalty, it's still around. It's just not used. The federal government did this with or state governments, actually. I believe most of them were Delaware corporations, did this with Enron. When a corporation starts behaving in a way that's toxic, you can dissolve the charter of that corporation. And this goes back to the idea that an economy is like a football game. You know, there are very specific rules, and back prior to the 1890s, the main set of rules in the United States, and corporate charters are state-based. There's very few federal corporations, and the ones that are weird hybrids, like Amtrak, for example. So every corporation in America was chartered in an individual state. And prior to the 1890s, every state had a requirement that the first purpose of a corporation was to serve the citizens of the state. And then the second purpose would be to make matchbooks or railroad cars or whatever they do. That in every state, every year or every 2 years, depending on the state, the Secretary of State was required to inspect the books of all the corporations chartered in that state. And if they determined that any of those corporations were behaving in ways that were not primarily in the interests of the citizens, they would dissolve the corporation. They would literally just pull the charter, say, you can't do business anymore. All of the assets would be sold. The corporation would cease to exist. In some cases, the assets were distributed to the stockholders. It depended on which state it was and whether the process involved a bankruptcy or not. And it happened a couple thousand times a year up until the 1890s. It was a fairly routine process. Also, most states had laws that limited the life of a corporation. Corporations couldn't live more than 20, 30, or 40 years, depending on the state. And then they had to basically reboot. It's kind of a variation on the idea of jubilee, which is another conversation. And states, regulated these corporations generally fairly aggressively. And that happened right up until the 1890s when John Rockefeller, when Ohio went after John Rockefeller, and he said, okay, what state wants to change their rules on this? And Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and Delaware got into a bidding war and on lowering their corporate charter requirements. But the corporate death penalty is still possible, and we could bring it back. It's just a matter of changing the rules.
Yeah, I'm interested in your analogy of a football game. I want to challenge you on that, because at least in my view, whether we have a football team and a football game is pretty irrelevant. Business is something that we absolutely have to fulfill all kinds of needs in society. But it's essential that it be done in a way that actually serves a society and is not just attempting to screw the society to grow fortunes of billionaires, which gets us into a lot of issues of how you organize the pieces after you break up Amazon. Do you have thoughts on restructuring the ownership? That
Sure.
would it be a whole different thing if the pieces were owned by the workers, or they were owned by customers, and kind of cooperative structures? My own sense is that we need to be thinking about structures that even go beyond any of the examples of cooperative ownership that we have today. But I'm very curious how you think about that.
Sure. Well, first, to torture the football metaphor, if we were watching an NFL game and the NFL had decided to change the rules so that any team that came from the west of the Mississippi could have 6 people on the field at any given time, and any team that came from east of the Mississippi could have 18 people on the field at any time, we would recognize that or if the goalposts were moved, we would recognize that the rules of the game had changed in a way that was pretty much going to predicate the outcome, was going to define the outcome. And that's what I'm saying. As we change the rules of business, we actually redefine who's most likely going to win and who's most likely going to lose. And, thus that metaphor. With regard,
there's another issue there that I think is very relevant to the American Sustainable Development Council. But I think the way they think about business is not that its primary function is to compete. Its primary function is to fulfill needs of the community.
I would argue that that's the job of government, and that government creates the playing field on which business happens and defines the rules. And the way that those rules are established will determine the outcome of the game of business. And as you say, a necessary game, but a game nonetheless. And I'm a big fan of, beneficent corporations, B corporations, and worker-owned cooperatives. I wrote a book titled Threshold: The Crisis of Western Civilization. And the last chapter of the book was all about worker-owned cooperatives. I went to actually travel all around the world. We went to Mondragon, Louise and I, and I was up in Minneapolis, Peninsula Machinery Company, Union Cab Company in Madison, Wisconsin. Companies that are owned by their employees. Those seem to operate at the highest level of not just efficiency, but appropriate role in the community, as opposed to just a corporation that's invented just to make money.
This gets us into fundamental questions of how we view our human nature, and whether we are fundamentally individualistic and competitive in the manner of the neoliberal framework, or whether we are fundamentally cooperative and caring.
And collaborative, yeah.
Collaborative, yeah. And I do lean toward the latter, and I think you do too. And clearly there is a competitive aspect of business, but at least the way I see competition in terms of the businesses that I really admire, it's a competition to provide the very best service, be the best contributor to whatever you're doing in terms of provision for labor, care for the environment, providing high quality products that really work and serve. It's just part of the deeper conversation.
But we need to be really clear that competition, the terms of that competition, who can do what is called competition. Yeah. How far can a company go in going after a competitor? What tools are available to them? All of those things are defined by the rules which are established by government. The only reason that we have a largely monopoly-run economy in the United States and they don't in Sweden is because our two governments made different rules for the game of business.
Yeah, well, the rules are clearly essential. Now we're going to need to move to the Q&A. I do want to throw one other piece in here very quickly, which relates to the corporate charter. And a corporate charter is issued by a government, and somehow we've gotten to a place where if a government issues a corporate charter, it expects it has the right to do business anywhere in the world. And I'm kind of curious what your thought would be on going back to, well, if you're a business and you get a corporate charter, you can do business in the jurisdiction of whatever government issued it. But if you want to go to somebody else's jurisdiction, you need to get their permission and essentially a charter for doing business in that jurisdiction.
Yeah. There are two issues there. One is international and the other is domestic. Internationally, I'm a big fan of Alexander Hamilton's 11-point plan that he laid out in 1791 and was implemented in 93. And in fact, I want to make that one of the books in this series, the Hidden History of Free Trade. Domestically, I think that we could accomplish probably a lot of what you're talking about if individual states, particularly Delaware, which is where more than half of all the companies that are publicly traded are chartered, and probably the majority of American corporations are chartered because their laws are so loose. The result of that 1890, in the 1890s, that charter mongering era that John Rockefeller kicked off. If those charter rules were tightened up so that, if you had a Delaware corporation and they were selling a product in Nebraska that was messing with Nebraska citizens, that the state of Nebraska could notify the state of Delaware, and Delaware could, pull their chain. Mm-hmm. I think there's ways to do that don't require massive systemic rewritings of the rules.
Okay, we better turn this back over to the Q&A now. And
thank you. Thank you, David and Thom, for such an insightful discussion and sharing all your valuable thoughts with us on this important subject matter. A lot of questions have come in, so we're going to try to get to as many as we can. But the first one is please comment on the effect of Friedman's theory of shareholder primacy and the extent to which it has been taught to the nation's MBA students as if it was written on stone tablets, and its concomitant effect the way CEOs behave.
Yeah, there's a chapter about this in the book. Prior to the 1980s, the theory of American business was that a corporation had a number of constituencies that they had to respond to whom they held responsibilities. They held a responsibility to behave appropriately with regard to their local community. They had, wherever that may be, and maybe even an entire state, they had a responsibility to behave appropriately with regard to their employees. They had a constituency among their customers. The institution of the corporation itself needed to be respected by the corporation. And then there were the shareholders who the corporation had to respect. Milton Friedman came along and said, you know, capitalism and unrestrained capitalism, his view of capitalism, was this wonderful thing because millions, billions of decisions are being made in the marketplace in any given moment. And therefore, the marketplace is the greatest democracy. It's the great leveler. It's where everything should get decided. And because of that, the shareholders are really the ones who own the company. Well, it's not even so much because of that. I'm kind of, these are two parallel thoughts. Let's go back to shareholders. And that the shareholders, because they're the ones who own the company, really should be the only, or at least the first among equals, of the constituents to whom the corporation is responsible. This ideology was picked up by Robert Bork and was promoted with regard to monopoly. There's a twist to it that the only thing that a government should look at when it comes to deciding whether or not a company is operating as a monopoly is whether people are paying higher prices. We're obviously way past that one. But Bork was also a big fan of shareholder primacy. And the result of that is that decisions that corporations used to make, where they used to say, well, what impact is this going to have on the community? What impact is this going to have on our workers? How might this affect our customers? They're no longer asking those questions. They're asking the question, are we going to increase the price of our stock or increase our ability to pay dividends, period. And as a result of that, markups, profit margins have exploded. And I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers right in front of me. As I recall, they were in the 20 to 30% range back in the 60s, and they're in the 70 to 80% range now, but don't hold me to those numbers. They're in the book, but it's that kind of a shift. And so much of the money in the American economy now is being siphoned off to the shareholders, which is why you have these, people who have become billionaires, accumulating hundreds of thousands, millions of money representing millions and millions and millions of person hours of labor, that they're just, sitting on.
Thank you. Another question: don't U.S. unions deserve some of the blame for their loss of clout due to the monopolization of power by many corrupt union bosses?
This is one of the favorite chants of the anti-union right, is that unions are corrupt, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact of the matter is there were some corrupt union leaders. Jimmy Hoffa is probably the most famous example. He gave Richard Nixon a $500,000 bribe. He paid Santo Trafficante $1 million to kill Jack Kennedy. It's some pretty grim stuff there that was done by union bosses. But the unions themselves, just because you have a criminal running a union doesn't mean that unionism is corrupt or that the unions themselves were corrupt. It means that in a very small number of cases, you had criminals running unions. That should be dealt with the same way that we deal with criminals running businesses. All the tax fraud, for example, that we see in the Trump organization doesn't mean that we should say, oh my God, look at that. We shouldn't have corporations anymore because, look at what Donald Trump did. No, it means that you've got one guy who's behaving like a criminal within the corporate form. So no, I don't buy that at all, that unions are responsible for their own demise. The demise of unions largely, and I go into this in some detail in my book on the Supreme Court. And the chapter about that, specifically all the Supreme Court decisions that destroyed unions, is actually online. It's on our website. From that book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court, The Betrayal of America. That's really, that has been the tip of the spear in terms of destroying unions. It's been the Supreme Court.
Great. The next question has to do with the Supreme Court. Please address the need for confronting the Supreme Court to protect our elections from corporate influence by passing the constitutional amendment to end money as free speech and corporate use of constitutional rights by the We the People Amendment to overturn Citizens United.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this, and I've worked toward it and for it for years. MoveToAmend.org is, one of, and Public Citizen.org, great organizations working in this field. In my book on the Supreme Court, I laid out how the Supreme Court, Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution says that the Supreme Court shall operate under regulations and with exceptions as defined by Congress. Which means literally that Congress could pass a law and say the Supreme Court may not rule on this. I don't think that my personal opinion, and I realize this is a very controversial opinion, but my personal opinion is that we don't need a constitutional amendment to do this, that Congress could pass a law saying corporations do not have access to the rights embodied in the Bill of Rights. They are not persons under the law, or at least they're not equal to natural persons under the law, and that money is not free speech. Spending money is not a dimension of free speech. The Congress could simply do that and include a court stripping provision that says, and the Supreme Court may not rule on this. It would probably provoke a constitutional crisis, but I think it would be a good thing.
Thank you. Another question, how has our monopoly economy combined with the COVID response bills affected small business?
Well, the fact of the matter is most business in the United States now is giant corporations, and even a lot of small businesses are really just subsets of giant corporations. A lot of McDonald's are owned by franchisees, not necessarily rich people, a lot of Motel 6s or 7-Elevens or whatever, a lot of these, but really they are operating under the umbrella of, and frankly under the thumb of, a giant monopolistic or oligopolistic corporation. So, we just need to take that on.
Let me just throw in there quickly that we need to be aware of the two kinds of structures. There is the McDonald type structure where they are tools of that corporation, but I'm also fascinated by the structure of say Ace Hardware, where the central headquarters is actually owned by the member firms.
Right.
So it's providing supporting services that the smaller firms all need and benefit from. So they look very similar, but they're in their real nature deeply different. I think
right. In that case, the franchisor is essentially a marketing organization. And with McDonald's and many of these other ones, some of them, they own some of their stores outright, and then they franchise others. It's kind of a mixed bag. But the other point that I would add,
at least by my understanding, the corporation is owned by these stores, which is very different than getting.
Right. That's a cooperative.
To sell.
Is it not?
It's a form of cooperative, but I don't think it's usually referred to as a cooperative.
Right, and those are the exceptions rather than the rule.
Yeah, but
I would add that as
structure. These are the kinds of innovations that we need to be thinking about, because there is an advantage in terms of efficiency to having some of these common services,
right.
Common branding.
Yeah, I agree. And I would just add in answer to the question that economic power in the United States equals political power, particularly since the Supreme Court has said that spending money to influence politics is free speech. And therefore, where economic power is most concentrated, which is our large corporations, so too is our political power. And that's why,
absolutely,
every piece of legislation that helps out during the COVID crisis helps out big corporations first.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your thoughts on the Fed buying a controlling interest in Amazon?
I don't think that's the way to do it. I don't think the Fed should be owning or buying any corporation. for the first time, I believe for the first time in its history in the last year, under Jay Powell, who is not an economist. Jay Powell is one of the former directors of the Carlyle Group, an investment group that invests in defense contractors. He's got a degree in political science. He's a politician, essentially, and a banker. And Jerome Powell, I think, has violated the Fed charter in creating $7 trillion out of thin air and using that money to buy the stock of publicly held corporations and to buy their bonds, to loan them money in order to keep the stock market afloat so that Donald Trump can get himself reelected. I think it's a crime. And I don't think that the Fed should be owning any business.
I think we also need to be clear that Fed sort of presents itself as a government institution, but it's not really accountable to government in any meaningful sense.
Correct.
It's really run by the bankers. So.
Right, although it does have a federal charter. It's one of those few federal corporations.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's owned by its, 10-member banks, I believe.
What are your thoughts on how have 401ks blow to the stock market and mutual funds?
I don't know. That's not something that I've examined in depth.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that needs a lot of examination. That one of the things about retirement funds, it should be deeply interested in the long-term interests of the people whose assets they manage. And this system, the way it's playing out currently, it places essentially human extinction on the table, self-extinction. That's not in the long-term interests of retirees and their children. I think we need to get that out there and do a lot of fundamental rethinking about how those investment funds are used.
The last comment in question is monopoly capitalists are not going away, even after the upcoming election. On a planet of 8 billion people, any economic restructuring will have to be global, not just in the US. How can this be approached?
Well, I don't, it's a noble idea, but the fact of the matter is that there are, 198 nation states or 197, I think, around the world. And many of them have very different approaches to their economies than we do. Saudi Arabia's economy is run very differently than, just down the road, Israel's economy, for example. So I'm focusing in this book, the principles that I'm talking about are applicable pretty much anywhere. But I'm focusing on this book on how we turn America back into a country where where the rules of the economy are reconfigured to benefit communities, individuals, and ultimately, life, the environment and things like that, rather than simply to benefit the billionaire class, which has been the result of, Friedman's ideas as applied by the Reagan Revolution.
Jump in there quickly since we're coming to the end.
You're the economist, actually, David.
Yeah. Well, one of my projects currently is working with a number of a group of business school professors who were challenging what's called the theory of the firm, which is part of this neoliberal frame that the purpose of the firm is to maximize profits. And what we're working on is the theory of community, that instead of organizing the global economy around the theory that everything is properly controlled by corporations to maximize their profit, that life organizes and exists only in communities that self-organize to create and maintain the conditions essential to their own well-being. And that our dominant theory has to be a theory of community, and how do we manage as communities to maximize well-being? And then that means the firm has to be subordinate ultimately to the community. It puts a whole different frame around the whole structure of society. It also has lots of implications for the international economy, the global economy.
I think the issue is one of homeostasis. Ultimately, the ability to continue to survive going forward. The metaphor that I use in the book is cancer. that when an individual cell in the body says, I'm going to take it all, I'm going to take all the energy out of this body, and reroutes all the blood vessels to itself. And we call that cancer, and it ultimately kills the organism. That essentially is what a monopoly is in a capitalist economy. It's cancer. And it's not sustainable. It's not homeostatic. It accumulates massive wealth. It creates extraordinary destruction. And ultimately, it collapses, or it collapses the larger system around it. And I think, frankly, we're in that state. We're in the early stages of that collapse right now here in the United States.
Yes.
Great. Any final comments from David or Thom?
David?
Well, I thank you for putting this together. I think it's clear to all of us that this is a conversation. I mean, one of the ways I frame the people that I've worked most closely with, we frame this as a transformation to a new civilization. Some of us call it an ecological civilization. It begs the question of whether what we have called civilization in the past is actually civilized, but it puts the focus on the fact that where we need to go is very different than any place that we have been in the past. And while we have a tremendous amount to learn from the past, anybody that thinks they have the solution or the answer for where we need to go doesn't understand the problem. And these conversations like we're having here are to me exactly the kinds of conversations that we need to drive forward with people who are thoughtful, they're serious, they're committed, they realize we've got to go for deep change, and we've got to all put our ideas in the pot and play this through.
I couldn't have said it better, and thank you, David, for moderating this, or for participating with me in this conversation. I recommend people check out your works as well. And Ali Reza, thank you so much for having us here with the American Sustainable Business Council. It's an honor to be here. You guys are doing God's work, and I wish you well. And thank you to everybody who showed up.
Thank you both. Thank you to all the attendees. Many thanks to Thom and David. Everybody out there, if you don't have a copy yet, please go get a copy of the Hidden History of Monopolies: How Big Business Destroyed the American Dream, to dig deeper into some of the points that were brought out on today's webinar. I've also included in the chat the work ASBC recently has published on creating an economic system that works for all, that addresses the issue of monopolies as well. And I've also included the link on how you can join ASBC SBC if you're not a member yet and would like to be a part of our community to help build a vibrant, prosperous, and sustainable economy. Thank you all. Bye-bye.